what is the big stories here, right? Can you tell us like in 1 or 2 sentences, just to recap the central ideas of your argument?
Well, I can definitely start off. If we take the point of departure from my research or my PhD dissertation, the argument is simply that China is entering a new phase of development, and underpinning or underwriting this new phase of development are new patterns of socio-spatial differentiation and patterns of exclusion. And I look at that through 3 lenses or 3 patterns of geographical restructuring: changing coastal inland relations, first of all; second of all, changing rural-urban relations; and third of all, the internal reconfiguration of those so-called post-industrial city regions, metropolises. So I think that simplifies it. And I do that through the lens of variegated capitalism, which requires more than a few sentences, I guess, to summarize.
Yeah. And how about you, Anil?
Well, I guess the point I was trying to make is to look at capitalism or the capitalist mode of production, not only from the perspective of production and not even only from the perspective of finance, but from the perspective of life and labor. And if we do so, then we can see that within the capitalist mode of production, there's always a split between a reproductive and a productive sphere in a way. And I'm interested, or I'm curious in how this intersection plays out when we look at current forms of indebtedness. And so my research started off looking at the whole microfinance discourse, but I soon realized that in order to understand the current microfinance hype, we have to go back in history and to look in where this indebtedness of households and the split between the reproductive and the productive sphere comes from. And I guess that's the whole story I'm trying to tell in my PhD thesis.
Okay, so just to unpack your theoretical framework, right? So you mentioned many big words and jargons. So could you, for Alex, right? Could you please clarify what are the differences between the varieties of capitalism and the variegated of capitalism, right? In simple plain English. And for Anil, right? You throw the words of mode of production, historical materialist approach. So could you please like explain simply, like what do those words mean to you? Because like those words might mean different things to different people, right? So why not go with Alex first?
Yeah. So if you juxtapose, or let's use a more simple word, if we compare varieties of capitalism with variegated capitalism, the primary critique of varieties of capitalism is that it has some very static assumptions about the way in which development takes place. It first assumes that developments converge around national varieties. And that means that within those nation states or countries, the mode of development is relatively undifferentiated. So it's very homogeneous. The assumption then by variegated capitalism is to abandon those assumptions. It basically argues that we should understand capitalism as a much more dynamic system. And to that end, we have to adopt a relational and a processual perspective to understand the polymorphic suggesting the various forms it can exist or coexist or be co-constituted within national containers or beyond national containers. So in terms of cross-border corporations and whatnot. So I think to put it very simply, varieties of capitalism has very static assumptions inherited in part from international relations theory that has historically adopted very methodologically nationalist assumption. But variegated capitalism tries to depart from those methodologically nationalist assumption that only attributes causal significance to the national scale, and instead says that we have to problematize these things by looking at subnational scales and also supranational scales, and most importantly, the interscalar dynamics. That is to say, the dynamics between different scales.
So basically, we move the level of analysis, right, from the national level to subnational levels or the regional levels.
Right, and the argument is not to say that the national level does not matter altogether. And that's why it's important to emphasize that it's a multi-scalar perspective, such that we understand how different scales are relationally co-constituted. Why we can understand partly the national context on the basis of the subnational context. Also how we can understand the national context on the basis of the supranational context in which it is embedded. So it doesn't attach causal primacy to necessarily one scale.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's go to Anil. I will come back to you with a follow-up question on that.
Right. So on the historical materialist question, I guess, I mean, the point of Marx and Engels was to speak about materialism in contrast to idealism, right? And their critique of idealist philosophy, especially German idealist philosophy, was that these brilliant thinkers were developing their theories, but not so much in relation to the real world out there, right? They were more practicing the theories in their head. And the point of materialism then here is to engage more and develop a theory that is really oriented on the livelihoods of the people, particularly of those oppressed classes in society. And to look at this historically is precisely what I've tried to do, right? Looking at a current phenomenon like the indebtedness of subaltern working classes in India, and trying to understand this through a historic analysis to see where are the roots of this indebtedness, you know, who benefits from this and how is this linked, like how can we understand this as a result of where colonialism and capitalist logics intersect. Yeah.
Okay. So now I have a follow-up questions, right? So based on your presentation, my impression, that's just my personal impression, is that both of you take a more structuralist approach to understand capitalisms. And so for me, I just curious about who are the actors, right? So in other words, like who are the people actually driving these processes? You know, for example, in the China case, you know, who are the people, you know, and also in India case. So maybe Anil, you can go first this time.
Yes, I mean, it was a 50 minutes presentation, but I do agree. I mean, I have a structuralist argument here, but of course there are actors and I mentioned them. I mean, the migrant laborers themselves being powerful actors, and they are, as I said, some sort of like new working class in India. But on the other hand, you also have other classes like the professional money lenders and landlords I've talked about, or microfinance organizations, which used to be NGOs in a charitable development area, and they have moved up and professionalized and became financialized and linked to global financial markets, right? And of course, you also have the role of the state as an actor here, which I mentioned, that plays different roles. And that's why I look at it historically, because the role of the British colonial state in the 19th century was of course entirely different than the role of the developmental state in the post-colonial era. And again, that one is quite different from the increasingly authoritarian debt-fair state that we see currently under the BJP government. So I think there's a lot of agency here, but I would agree still that my argument is largely a structuralist argument, yes.
So you differentiate, right, in different phases of development of capitalism. They are different actors, right? Am I getting it correct? So that's why we try to theorize, right? Is there like in the first phase during the British imperial period, was there like a dominant actor, and during the second phase, and so on and so forth, or are the actors more or less, you know, the same?
Well, no, the actors are not the same. I mean, it's different people that live, right? But I think, I mean, the basic way I look at it is, of course, from a class perspective. So I look at different class fractions and classes that have ruled, and I guess that's the major point here, that class formation is not a static thing. It's not like a working class emerged in the 19th centuries and then it remains the same. But class formation is a continuous process. And my argument with these three regimes is not really that these are three different types of capitalism, but it's more to pinpoint to different configurations of how the indebtedness of working class households in relation to their subsistence is governed differently, right? And I think that's the main argument I'm trying to make with these regimes. And that's why I also speak of regimes, because they, like, a regime for me is where different logics of oppression and power intersect in a geographical and spatial defined place, right?
Yeah, and Alex, and how about the people in your theoretical framework?
No, I mean, I think the initial charge of being structuralist is something that was raised against the varieties of capitalist approach, right? This latent functionalism is basically equivalent to saying that varieties of capitalism is very structuralist. So I think that definitely variegated capitalism, although it might not immediately be evident from our presentation, is by all means attempting to outline different possibilities of agency. So above all, I told you that variegated capitalism is based on the assumption that it's a processual perspective. Processual perspective means that we have to understand the concrete social processes through which capitalist development does happen, and how that within a historically and geographically contingent context forms layered development. So then the question is, what is the relationship between structure and agency? And I think the best quote is, of course, always to go back to Marx's initial quote from 18th Brumaire, where he says that men make their own history, but not under self-selected circumstances. And these are the similar changes that are confronted with Chinese actors, um, such as subnational provincial governments, and also the national government organized around the central government. Um, these different actors, of course, do not act in a vacuum. So they are confronted with specific structural constraints, and that means that they are limited to what they can do. They have to resolve different horizons of contradictions that they are facing. Just like now, China is entering a phase of not stagnation, but radical slowdown, where it can no longer maintain its double-digit growth. Then in order to maintain the legitimacy of the party and to restore growth engines, it has needed to confront these contradictions. And so that has put them on a specific, I guess, path-locked mode of development. But then to summarize, what are the actors involved? I mean, that is also the beauty of a variegated capitalism research program, that it really opens up for a lot of possibilities of different angles. And of course, it depends on the subject. In terms of the existing research that has been done, yes, there is less focus on concrete actors. They vaguely refer to the Chinese Communist Party as an actor, but of course, that multi-scalar perspective already holds the promise of multiple actors interacting, namely differentially situated scalar actors are responsible in this co-production process of capitalist space and capitalist subnational models.
But do individual matter, I mean, in your theoretical framework? I mean, this is a question, right? For
Absolutely,
both.
absolutely. So in order to avoid functionalism, and this is here where we can learn a lot from Bob Jessup's perspective of the strategic relational approach, and critical realism more broadly, as the philosophical underpinnings of that research. The idea is obviously that things do not just spontaneously emerge because of some inherent functionalist logic as articulated by varieties of capitalism. Instead, you should think about capitalist development as a trial and error process. But that trial and error process can log into specific patterns, depend on the structural coupling, the discursive coupling, the ideological coupling between different modes of development. So there are specific objective conditions that actors within a capitalist economy have to confront to resolve its contradictory tendencies. So in that sense, there is some sort of lock-in effect. But within that lock-in effect, there's a variety of opportunities. And from trial and error processes, where you do some things right, some things wrong, suddenly a more stable pattern of development emerges eventually. So it's always ex post facto that we see, oh, this is this phase of development, which is characterized by this bundle of institutions, while in fact, the actual process through which things coalesce around specific conglomerations or specific agglomerations is often due to trial and error. And well, when we write history, a lot of those trials and those errors have been overlooked, are not part of the narrative anymore. Yeah.
So do individuals matter in your theoretical framework, Anil? Or let me push even further to this argument, right? I mean, between the agencies and structure, which one actually matters more, or which one actually is the driving force that changed the whole economic development? If we frame like this way, right?
Well, I guess the problem starts when you separate structure and agency, and then you say like, which one matters more. I think both matter, and both are entangled, because I mean, as Alex has referred to this wonderful quote from the 18th Brumaire of Marx, I mean, it's not like there's agency without structure, and there's no structure without agency, because agency is what creates structures. And then again, structures constrained agency. So I think this whole debate around structure agency, I'm not really, I don't buy into it. And about the question of whether individuals matter, I mean, I hope this came through in my presentation. And this is why I started with this image and with a poem, because what I'm trying to say is that, I'm not theorizing these developments just for fun. It's about the livelihoods of people. And it's really a question of life and death for, millions of laborers who live under such precarious conditions at a time when we witness a growth model in the Indian context, which is extremely dynamic, or has been dynamic for several years, but has really benefited only a rather small share of society. So of course, individual matters. And I'm trying to focus on these migrant laborers and trying to understand how post-colonial capitalism works through their livelihoods. And I guess structure and agency do play an equally important role in this context. Because as I said, I mean, taking on credit is an agency. It's a powerful strategy for the people, and it's absolutely rational and makes sense very often. But at the same time, it is a choice that is made under highly constrained circumstances, right? And so I think, like, within the livelihoods of these migrant laborers, you can really see how structure and agency converge.
Yeah. So do you have anything to add, Alex, before we move on to the next question?
I'll just conclude that I think if you really want to engage in those deep discussions about structure and agency, I think the best scholars to look at it from is like Margaret Archer and a morphogenetic approach. Look at Anthony Giddens and his structuration approach, and Bob Jessam's strategic relation approach. I think my contribution is not as much as engaging in those discussions, but it definitely falls within the broader assumptions of those critical realist traditions. So that I think that's the backdrop against which I develop my arguments.
Yeah. So now we move to the next question, right? We move a little bit beyond China and India. So I wonder, do your theoretical frameworks can apply to other countries? Or like in social science, jargon, right? It's the external validity. So I mean, so you apply the variegated capitalism to China, and you apply the post-colonial approach to India. But do they, can you apply them to other cases? That this framework, it's only limited to the Indian and the Chinese case?
I would say the whole point about this research program, and that's also why I specifically call it a research program, is because it is informed by a number of methodological, ontological, and epistemological assumptions about how we theorize and understand capitalism. And because it is formulated on such a general level, it can indeed be applied to any given context. One of the assumptions of variegated capitalism is that we live in a tendentially global capitalist system. And that's, once again, to say that, well, if within the context of global capitalist system, there are cross-cutting relations and networked relations, and logistical geographies, production networks that form cross-cutting relations. And on the basis of that, we can understand various capitalist economies and the integration with global circuits of capital to apply the same framework. So I would say, yes, it has a high degree of application to other perspectives, although we have to be sensitive then to the historically and geographically contingent conditions under which these other capitalist economies have emerged.
Well, my concept of reproductive finance definitely speaks to a lot of experiences in other places of the world, because essentially it's about, this idea that working class households take on credit, and very often this credit is even financialized, in order to make ends meet and in order to make a living under highly precarious circumstances. So I think, this concept really talks to a lot of the literature on the financialization of social reproduction, which has been theorized particularly for the UK and the US and some other OECD countries. And so I do see a lot of parallels here, of course. But at the same time, I think it's important to apart from this very abstract level where, finance becomes a means of life for working class households, apart from these abstract notions, I think it's important to actually trace back the histories in geographically specific areas. And this is what I'm trying to do for the Indian context, because I feel there's a huge debate in literature on microfinance and financial inclusion, but there's a very little historical contextualization of how this is linked to a broader history of how subaltern working classes have been indebted since colonialism.
Yeah, so now why don't we do a thought experiment? So why not, like, Alex, put yourself into Anil's shoes and vice versa, and then now try to think if Anil's theoretical framework, right, can apply to the Chinese case. Conversely, Anil, so does the variegated capitalism approach can also apply to the Indian case? So basically, what it means is, are there different regional differences in terms of economic development or the development in capitalism? So just think from each other's perspective and see if this two perspective can, apply to each other's cases. So who wants to start? Yeah, feel free.
I'll just go ahead and maybe give my 2 cents. So, I mean, broadly, the question is to outline what exactly are the positions of Anil. And if you take it from the more general positions that he's adopting from a post-colonial perspective, from a feminist perspective, I think definitely those modes of analysis apply to a very high degree to the Chinese context. Although, admittedly, it is much less developed within the context of China because of its colonial ties have been, or its context within a global colonial system has been slightly different. So, for instance, talking about social reproduction and the process through which social reproduction happens, that's a very relevant research question in relationship to how we see that the semi-proletarianization of migrant workers in China actually has a similar function. So because of the hukou system in China, right, people who move from rural areas to big cities do not have the same social rights, historically speaking. There's been reforms in more recent years. And because of that, the social reproduction costs of those people, first of all, are externalized to the rural areas. That basically means that these people can be compensated at a lower rate, right? So one example within variegated capitalism is so-called dormitory capitalism. Those of you who are familiar with Foxconn and those big manufacturing industries that are situated around the coastal areas, or have been historically speaking, they are great examples of where workers are all clumped into one area. The cost of social reproduction, living, eating, and whatnot is lowered radically. The cost of raising a family is also externalized to the rural areas because they don't live together with their husbands, because and wives, if it's the other way around. So then the theories about the feminist perspective is very relevant. From a post-colonial perspective, I think that, of course, also must be problematized. While China has not been directly colonized, obviously, if you think about the last 150 years with the Opium Wars and the subsequent loss of Hong Kong, and et cetera, I think there are really good evidence to show that colonial influences have had enduring patterns of exploitative relations, and the preferred access to different parts of China due to those power relationships have also enduring influences of the development of specific areas, like the French concession in Shanghai and whatnot. So that post-colonial perspective is also relevant. Now, then more specifically to the theoretical concept of finance, India and China are kind of on the same developmental trajectory. But I think it is quite notable that China's developmental trajectory is a little bit ahead of India, and its growth rate has also been slightly higher. And some people might say that India is 10 or 15 years behind China's growth trajectory. So to that extent, China is much more ahead of combating poverty alleviation. Those of you who are familiar, for instance, with global poverty indexes, and when we talk about we've lowered people below the global poverty line by so and so many billions or hundreds of millions, a majority of which has actually been China and their programs targeting poverty. So, of course, because of that different stage of that developmental trajectory, and of course, I don't want to engage into linear approaches of development, because that might also be structuralist or deterministic, then we see that some of the issues that Anil raises are less applicable but still relevant for many rural areas in China, where many people still remain impoverished and are starved from economic opportunities. So that element of marginalization, concepts such as the subaltern, can also variably be imposed or applied productively, I would say, to those people and those groups of people.
And how about Anil?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Like, I think what I found very useful during the talk of Alex to understand also in the Indian context is the whole concept of uneven and combined development. And I think if we look at this, rural-urban dynamics as a metabolism and not as two separate spheres, and I think that's certainly something that does apply to the Indian context, of course, because I mean, this is exactly what the image that I showed in the beginning try to capture also. It's not only the migrant laborers leaving the cities, but we would also see, the advertisements of Samsung and other big transnational companies and national companies also in the Indian context. And so the whole uneven, like the whole growth model in India has been extremely uneven. In these global cities like in Bangalore, for example, where electronic cities have emerged that try to compete with other transnational IT services, while at the same time you have a growth of poverty and slums. And so I'm not quite sure whether the argument that Alex made that 10, 15 years down the road, if India has more growth, the poverty will be alleviated. I think the experience of the past decade or past 2 decades has actually been that despite growth rates, or maybe even because of the type of growth that is happening, because of this uneven and combined type of growth, there has been a massive increase in wealth for certain sections of society, while at the same time others have become even more impoverished and even more prone to hunger. And
is there like a regional disparity between the coastal area and then the inland area in India?
Well, there are huge regional disparities, but it's not only the coastal versus the inland areas. It really depends on which state you look at. And of course, also the story that I said, I mean, I try to give a uniform story, but if you look at how these dynamics play out, then states like Kerala would be quite different to West Bengal, and they would again be different than UP. So of course you can differentiate by state, and that's again where this multi-scalar perspective from the variegated capitalism approach can be useful in understanding the differences at a subnational level, and also understanding different governments and political cultures that shape different policies, etc. So again, that would be something where this multi-scalar perspective can be very useful to understand also the realities in India.
So there are multiple regional models in India too.
Yeah, if you want to call them models, I mean, there are certainly very different trajectories of development, right? But for example, there's a lot of talk around the Kerala model of development as a state, as a communist state, which has much higher literacy rates, lower poverty rates, which has dealt also with this corona pandemic quite differently than other states, and has ensured access to basic health services. And so, yeah, if you want to call it models, there are different developments in different states that we can see.
Like what I mean by models is that like in some place where the state plays a more dominant role, whereas in other places they play more like the market plays a more important role, or it could be a combination, right? So what I mean by models is it like more state-driven development, or it's more like a free market-driven?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to characterize that, of course, in those states where communist governments are in place, you have a stronger welfare state, you have a bigger role of state investments and national companies, etc. But I think it's not only a question of whether you have public companies or whether you have a market-based approach. It's linked to so much more. It's also about the resources. It's about the diversity of your economy. It's about the class and caste relations that exist. So I think, only limiting it to the question of whether there is a strong state or whether it's a market-based approach doesn't really capture the diversity of economies in India. And I think, what my research also tries to do is through speaking about this migrant labor, I'm trying to show the fluidity of people moving from certain spaces where they cannot subsist anymore to other spaces like mega cities where they think they can live, right? And I think this mass migration of 100 million migrant laborers speaks to the unevenness of the development that we see all over the subcontinent.
So yeah, so I have a last question before we open the floor. So yeah, so my last question actually is related to a research that I'm currently doing. So I analyze different local and regional culture and how they shape regional economic development. So based on my impressions, right, you both of you have been talking about the socioeconomic condition and also the political structures that shape this development and growth. So I wonder, right, how about the cultural dimension we haven't really touched upon? Do you think that, for example, in the Alex case, do you think the regional culture actually shaped the variegated development, right? For example, in the Wenzhou model, they have more market-oriented, whereas in the Suna model, the local village enterprise plays a more dominant role. And also in the per Delta region, they have more foreign direct investment. But that you can trace back to the historical legacies and the regional and local cultures. So I wonder, like, what do you think about that? I mean, is there cultural dimensions to what you been talking about?
It's definitely a good point. I think you'd be hard pressed to deny the relevance of culture altogether. But first of all, I think maybe there's a matter of defining what is culture. If you have a more encompassing definition of culture, this idea about culture as a representation of ideas, ideology, and whatnot, or if we talk about very specific conceptions of culture, cultural practices, and rituals. If you have that more encompassing perspective that also encompasses ideas, also rituals, but also ideology, I think definitely it's important that we also adopt a broadly speaking cultural perspective. Of course, you're familiar with but Jessup's cultural political economy, which of course, with a lot of neologisms, also attempts to engage with some of the thought processes that you're highlighting right now. So I think definitely in my own research, I'm actually not sure, because in that sense, I am convinced of the primacy of some of those political, socioeconomic processes, as you also outlined just before. But definitely arguments have to be made about the specific spatial imaginaries or developmental imaginaries that might be attached to specific regions, and how there might be a discursive coupling or an ideological coupling between specific modes of development and others. Chongqing, for instance, has been known for its pivot with the recently the Fallen from Grace authority. The question is, well, is that just merely a political maneuvering that has been enabled by that political leader, or is that a result of cultural differences? I'm not quite convinced that the culture is that important source of explanation. So if anything, when you introduce the cultural explanation, I think it raises a range of other questions which might produce very fruitful research avenues. Although for my specific line of research, I haven't been quite convinced that the cultural element is what really matters. And that's why it takes a downplayed role or really falls back in the background.
Yeah, I guess the question really is, what do you mean by culture? I mean, is the caste system culture, or is it political, or is it economic? Is patriarchy culture, or is it political, or is it economic? I mean, it's all of it, right? And so, I mean, culture in the sense of, lived ideas and practices and rituals, but also like broader ideologies plays a huge role, of course. And the way I would look at it from my regime analysis is that each of these regimes, of course, is accompanied by a broader set of ideas and ideologies, or discourses, if you want so, that try to legitimize and speak about why these regimes of reproductive finance make sense, right? So for instance, in the current model of authoritarian neoliberalism in India, we can see huge mobilization of these caste differences and trying to split society along caste and class lines when it comes to, you know, welfare services and access to credit. And yeah, and I think like it's important to look at culture not as a separate sphere, but rather integrated with a political economy analysis.
Just quickly, maybe we can switch a little bit, right? Think about it differently. So, you know that there's Max Weber, right? He argues that the Protestant ethic is closely linked to the capitalist development. So I just wonder, is there kind of, you know, the spirit in China or in India that actually linked to the economic growth? Like,
well, I don't subscribe fully to the Max Weber argument, but if you want to pinpoint one such dynamic, then it would probably be Brahmanism, right? It would be this idea of a caste system that has been mobilized yet and again to argue for a divisioning of labor along caste lines and to legitimize highly exploitative conditions. And probably this comes closest, this idea of Brahmanism that is being mobilized currently quite vividly, comes closest to Weber's Protestant ethics in the Indian context, I guess.
and how about Alex?
No, I think I don't just fully subscribe to the idea either, but obviously one of the arguments, the caricatures that have been made is, oh, well, China is known for its Confucian work ethics. And we see there's some great parallels between Confucian work ethics in which there are ideas concerning hierarchy, obedience, rituals. Those ideas might have contributed to a more productivist society, which has enabled China to so-called have a fruitful encounter with capitalist modernity after 1978. But I think such explanations, while they might aid, causal explanations are deficient on their own. And therefore, I think, as Anil correctly said, we cannot think about culture as an isolated dimension. Another more theoretical or formalized way of saying it is that while it might be analytically distinct from politics and economics, they're not ontologically discrete. Just like agency and structure, while they're analytically distinct, they're not ontologically discrete. They are co-constituted. And so I think that's the best way to view it.
So thank you very much, Anil and Alex, to join this debate.